I used to believe that love could heal anything, that if you poured enough of yourself into a family, if you gave without keeping score, the bonds would hold even through the storms. But what I learned is that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who will cut you deepest, and the scars they leave never quite fade. My name is Rachel, and I'm 38 years old. For nearly 15 years, I was a wife and a stepmother. I gave everything I had to a family that was never truly mine, though I didn't realize it at first. I wanted so badly to believe I belonged. When I met Daniel, he was already a widower with 2 young children. His late wife had died tragically, leaving him alone to raise Benjamin, who was just 4 at the time, and Ellie, barely a baby. I still remember the first time I saw them. Benjamin was buzzing around the living room with toy cars, his little voice filling the space, while Ellie clung to her father's leg, her eyes wide and searching for safety. I had no children of my own then, and maybe that's why my heart ached to step in. Not because anyone asked me to, not because it was expected, but because I couldn't bear to watch them stumble alone through that darkness. I told myself I'll give them the love their mother would have given if she were still here, and for years I did exactly that. I was there for every scraped knee, every school recital, every bedtime story. I worked long hours at my job, but no matter how tired I was, I came home and cooked, cleaned, and tucked those kids into bed. I bought the birthday cakes, organized the parties, planned vacations, so they'd have memories worth holding on to. I didn't just provide, I poured my soul into them. They didn't just call me Rachel, they called me Mom. And every time I heard that word, my chest swelled with pride. I wasn't their biological mother, but I felt like I'd been chosen, entrusted with something sacred. And for a long time I thought they felt the same way. But love, I've learned, is fragile when it isn't rooted in truth. The first cracks were small. Little comments from Benjamin as he grew older, snide remarks about how I wasn't his real mom. Ellie would sometimes mimic him, rolling her eyes when I reminded her to clean up after herself or do her homework. I told myself it was normal teenage rebellion, that every parent goes through it. I brushed it off, convinced it would pass. But it didn't pass, it grew. By the time Benjamin turned 17, his defiance had hardened into contempt. He stayed out late, ignored curfews, and when I tried to talk to him, he looked at me like I was a stranger, trespassing in his life. Ellie, just 14, followed his lead. My words carried no weight. My efforts, my sacrifices, all of it was dismissed as if it had never mattered. What cut deepest wasn't their rebellion, it was Daniel's silence. Every time they talked back, every time they disrespected me, I would look to him, waiting for him to defend me, to remind them that I had been there when no one else was. But he never did. Sometimes he sighed, sometimes he looked away, but mostly he just let it happen. And slowly I began to realize the truth. He wasn't just failing to defend me, he agreed with them. The night that broke me is seared into my memory. Benjamin had come home well past midnight. I wasn't angry, I was worried. I asked him where he'd been. He smirked and said, "Relax, you're not my mom. You don't get to tell me what to do." Before I could even catch my breath, Ellie chimed in, "Yeah, you're just some woman Dad married." I turned to Daniel, desperate for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. He just stood there, his face blank, as if their cruelty were justified. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I had given them everything, my time, my love, my heart. And in return, I was nothing more than a placeholder, a stand-in they tolerated but never truly embraced. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at the walls of the home I had built with my bare hands. Memories of birthdays, holidays, laughter, they all felt hollow, now poisoned by the truth. I realized that if I stayed, I would be nothing more than a ghost in my own life, an invisible caretaker who gave endlessly, but was never seen. And so I made a choice. I stopped trying. No more picking up after them. No more covering their mistakes, paying their bills, softening their consequences. No more mothering children who spat in my face and a husband who let them. They said I wasn't their real mom, fine. Let them see what life was like without one. It was the hardest, most heartbreaking decision of my life. But it was also the first step toward reclaiming myself. The silence in the house after I pulled back was deafening, but not in the way I had feared. At first they didn't even notice. The dishes piled up in the sink, the laundry went undone, Ellie complained about not having her favorite shirt washed. Benjamin griped about empty cupboards, and Daniel, well, he just sat there waiting for me to cave as if my patience and sacrifice were endless. But I didn't. I remember the first morning they realized what my absence really meant. Benjamin stood in the kitchen slamming cabinet doors shouting, "There's nothing to eat." I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, calm, collected. I looked at him and said, "Then I guess you'd better figure it out. After all, I'm not your mother, right?" His face twisted, caught between anger and confusion. Ellie chimed in, whining about being late for school because no one had packed her lunch. I shrugged. "You're old enough to make one yourself." The look in her eyes, it wasn't just irritation, it was dawning realization. For years they had dismissed me, mocked me, diminished me. Now they were beginning to see exactly what I had carried for them all along. But it wasn't just about the chores or the meals, it was the emotional void that unsettled them most. They came home from school with stories to tell, complaints to air, victories to share. I had always been there to listen, to cheer, to comfort. But now, I just nodded politely and returned to whatever I was doing. I wasn't cruel, but I was distant, detached. And that absence hurt more than any scolding could have. Daniel, of course, tried to smooth it over. He told me I was being childish, that I needed to rise above their words, that this was just teenage attitude. His dismissal cut deeper than the kids' cruelty ever had. He wanted me to keep giving without acknowledgement, to accept my place as an outsider while shouldering the work of a mother. One night, after another argument where Benjamin told me to stop pretending to be mom, I turned to Daniel and asked, "Do you see me as their mother?" He hesitated. That pause, that tiny hesitation, was louder than any answer. Finally he said, "You're important to them in your own way. In your own way. Not as their mother, not as an equal, not as the woman who had raised them for over a decade, just something." That was the moment my love for him, whatever threads were still holding it together, began to unravel. Weeks passed and the house descended into chaos. Missed assignments, forgotten chores, arguments between siblings that escalated without me there to mediate. They had taken my presence for granted, and now my absence had become unbearable. The real turning point came one evening when Benjamin stormed into the living room, his face pale. He had failed a major exam at school. He had always counted on me to tutor him, to sit with him through hours of studying. Without my guidance, he had stumbled. "Why didn't you help me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. I looked at him steadily. "Because you told me I wasn't your mom. You made it clear I had no place." His mouth opened, but no words came out. For once he had nothing to throw back at me. Ellie followed soon after, breaking down in tears when she realized she'd missed a deadline for a project. She whispered, "You always reminded me before. I thought you would." She stopped herself, realizing too late what she had lost. And Daniel. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. He came home to a house that no longer ran smoothly, to children who were restless and resentful. He tried to patch the pieces together, but he couldn't replicate what I had done. He couldn't replace the love, the consistency, the invisible labor I had carried every single day. That was my revenge. Not screaming, not leaving in a storm of rage, but letting them taste the emptiness they had wished upon me. They said I wasn't a mother, so I stopped being one. They thought my presence was insignificant, so I disappeared into myself. And only then did they see the truth. I had been the spine of this family all along. It was a cruel satisfaction watching them struggle, but it was also laced with grief. Because beneath the anger I still loved them. I always had. That's what made it hurt so deeply, that love had been wasted on people who only recognized its value when it was gone. By the third month, the cracks in the family had widened into chasms. The kids argued constantly, the house was in disarray, and Daniel seemed perpetually exhausted, his face lined with frustration. I watched it all, quietly, detached but observant, like a ghost haunting the very life I had once built. Benjamin, who had once mocked me with smirks and rolled eyes, began to linger awkwardly near me. One evening, he hovered at the kitchen doorway while I was making tea for myself, a small ritual I still allowed. "Can you help me with this paper?" he asked, holding out his notebook. His voice was hesitant, almost ashamed. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Ask your father. Or your real mom. The words tasted bitter, but they were the truth he had thrown at me so many times. His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Not defiance, but vulnerability. He turned and walked away, shoulders slumped. Ellie tried next. She left a note on my nightstand. I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean it. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I couldn't let myself soften too soon. They needed to feel the weight of their words to understand the scars they had carved into me. Daniel, meanwhile, grew resentful. One night he confronted me, his voice sharp. This house is falling apart. You've proven your point. Enough is enough. I set my cup down carefully and met his gaze. No, Daniel, it's not enough. Not until you admit you let this happen. Not until you see how you abandoned me just like they did. He flinched, but he didn't argue, because he knew it was true. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was Ellie's 15th birthday. Normally I would have baked the cake, decorated the living room, planned the whole party down to the smallest detail. But this time, I did nothing. I sat on the porch with a book, while Daniel scrambled inside with balloons and half-hearted decorations. The cake was store-bought, lopsided, with her name misspelled in cheap icing. The kids tried to celebrate, but the joy was forced, brittle. Later that night I heard Ellie crying in her room. It didn't feel like my birthday, she sobbed. It didn't feel the same without her. Her words pierced me, but I didn't move. I stayed on the porch staring at the stars, letting her grieve the absence she had created with her own cruelty. Days later Benjamin broke. He came to me, tears streaming down his face, and whispered I didn't mean it. I was angry. I didn't know what I was saying. Please, come back. For a moment, I wanted to reach out to hug him, to erase the pain. But then I remembered all the times I had cried alone, unheard, dismissed, as too sensitive, too clingy, too desperate for love. I remembered Daniel's silence as they cut me down, so I said softly, you can't take back words once they're spoken. You can only live with the consequences. His sobs echoed through the hall, but I didn't follow. And then there was Daniel. One evening he finally broke his silence. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the air heavy with all that had been left unsaid. He looked at me, his voice raw. I failed you. I let them disrespect you, and I let you stand alone. I don't know how to fix this. For the first time in years I saw him stripped of pride. And it struck me then, this wasn't just about the kids, it was about him too. About a husband who had chosen the path of least resistance, who had abandoned his partner when she needed him most. I leaned forward, my voice steady. You can't fix it, Daniel. Some things break too deeply to be repaired. You let them believe I was disposable, and now they know what life without me feels like. That is your lesson, that is theirs. And it may already be too late. The silence that followed was suffocating. For once he had no defense, no excuses, just guilt, raw and heavy. And in that moment I realized my revenge was complete, not because they were broken, but because I was no longer willing to be. By the time the 4th month rolled around, something in me had shifted permanently. I no longer carried the ache of wanting to be accepted, nor the desperate hope of being called mom with sincerity again. That longing had died the night Daniel hesitated, the night his silence screamed louder than their words. What I carried now was clarity, sharp and unyielding. Benjamin and Ellie began to soften in ways I never expected. The boy who once sneered at me now tried clumsily to make conversation at dinner, asking about my day, offering to wash dishes. Ellie hovered near me like a shadow, leaving little tokens, drawings, notes of flower plucked from the yard, as if she could glue together the pieces she'd shattered. I accepted their gestures politely, but I didn't rush to rebuild the bridge. Because bridges once burned never look the same no matter how carefully you stack the ashes. Daniel, though, was different. He grew quieter, more haunted. He tried to pick up the slack, cooking, cleaning, parenting, but the kids resisted him. They were used to me holding it all together, and he simply wasn't enough. One evening I overheard Benjamin yelling at him, "She always made it better, and you let her leave us like this." The words landed like arrows, and I saw Daniel flinch in a way I never had before. For the first time he was tasting the abandonment I had swallowed for years. That night Daniel came to me, his face pale, his voice trembling. "Rachel," he said, "I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to make them listen, how to keep this family together. Please, I need you." I looked at him, my heart heavy but resolute. "You needed me years ago, Daniel, when they mocked me in front of you and you said nothing. You needed me when I begged you to see me, to defend me, to choose me. But you chose silence. You chose ease over truth. And now you're standing in the ruins of that choice." He bowed his head, tears sliding down his face. For a fleeting second, I almost reached for him, almost broke. But then I remembered all the nights I cried alone in our bedroom, while he sat in another room pretending not to hear. No, my sympathy had run out, so I told him what I had never dared before. "I'm done. With you, with this house, with carrying a family that never carried me back." And then I left. I rented a small apartment in the city, far from the chaos, far from the ghost of who I had been. It wasn't much, just a single bedroom, a view of the street below, but it was mine. Mine in a way nothing had been for so long. I painted the walls my favorite color, filled the shelves with books no one would mock, brewed coffee in the mornings without rushing to anyone else's schedule. Slowly I began to breathe again. The calls came, of course. Benjamin, his voice cracked with regret. Ellie whispering apologies through sobs. Daniel begging for another chance. I listened, but I didn't answer. Because my silence now wasn't despair, it was power. Months later, I heard through a mutual friend that things had fallen apart at the old house. Daniel struggled to keep the kids on track. Benjamin nearly failed his senior year. Ellie withdrew, her bright spirit dimmed by guilt. The home that had once echoed with laughter now carried only tension and regret. And me, I flourished. I joined a book club, made new friends, traveled for the first time in years. I rediscovered the woman I'd been before I was erased by their ingratitude, the woman who laughed loudly, dreamed boldly, and lived unapologetically. Sometimes I still think about those years, about the love I gave and the pain I endured. And though part of me aches for the children, for the bond that might have been, I know this: I could not save them from themselves, nor Daniel from his cowardice. I could only save me, and that is exactly what I did. So to anyone listening, anyone who has been told they are not enough, who has been mocked, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, hear me. You are more than the names they call you, more than the silence they weaponize against you. You do not need their permission to walk away, because sometimes this most powerful revenge is not in screaming, not in fighting, but in reclaiming your life so completely that they're left choking on the emptiness you leave behind. If my story spoke to you, please like, share, and subscribe. And leave a comment. I want to hear your story too, because none of us should ever feel invisible again.